All right, so before I introduce Paavo, just a few items here. If you want to keep up with the Lewis Center, you can sign up for our mailing list at lewis.ucla.edu. We have 2 other lectures coming up, one each quarter. Next quarter in winter, we will have Professor Jose Loya presenting on, we're not exactly sure what. He's actually doing exactly what you should do on paternity leave and not responding to our emails. But it will probably be something related to mortgages. And in the spring, we're going to have our wonderful postdoctoral scholar, Jessica Shermer, sharing her research on a whole bunch of stuff, coalitions, federal policy, missing middle, in US housing policy. So we've already seen his photo. Our speaker today is Paavo Monkkonen, professor of urban planning and a Lewis Center affiliate. Maybe you even have a formal title with us? Just affiliate, okay. Paavo spent the past 2 years on sabbatical in Lyon and Paris, France, learning about how their social housing system works and the lessons it might hold for social housing here and elsewhere. He was also learning French, adding it to his repertoire of English and Spanish, and also I've learned Finnish curse words. So maybe he'll show that off for us today. If you want to learn more about Paavo, this is my excuse to talk about our podcast. You can listen to the latest episode of our podcast, UCLA Housing Voice. We just published our 100th episode, and in that episode, you learn, among other things, that Paavo's job as a professor here is the realization of all of his worst nightmares as a child. So with that, Paavo, take it away.
Push and wait. Did that go on? Push and wait. Fine? On?
Yeah.
Miking? All right. Too loud?
Nope.
Great. All right. So, bonjour à tous et toutes. C'est un grand plaisir de vous voir ici. Nice to see you all. I'm not going to speak French. I did have to give a presentation in French to City of Paris staff. That was like the culmination of my time there, to about 60 people. And I practiced, and I think I did great. And then it was Q&A time, and it was like, oh man. I was not as prepared as I would have liked to be. But yeah, so I've been in France for the last 2 years, learning about social housing, among other things, how the French do urban planning, how different European countries do social housing. And so I'm very excited to share some of the things I learned with you today. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to do. I want to thank, I guess I should thank people. This is a partial list of all the super nice French people. It turns out are not rude. They're actually super nice. And so they're very welcoming and helped me a lot in learning about how their housing system works and how planning works there. There are a number of institutions of urban planning education that are also fantastic. And you know, they're in the Francophone world still, kind of for the most part. And so they know about some Anglophone stuff, and we kind of know a little bit about Francophone academic stuff, but kind of the communication is much too little because a lot of the issues are very similar on housing and urban planning and other things, as you might notice in this presentation. Great. So my plan for today is I brought a lot of pictures to show you kind of 100 years of social housing history in France. One of the motivations for this work, of course, is California wants to start a social housing program. And one of the fears is that because the Europeans have been doing it for 100 years plus, like there's no way we could catch up with what they've done. And so I'm doing some research that I'll talk about in part 3, which is kind of assuring that actually it's going to be okay. Just because we didn't start 100 years ago, we could do it if we wanted to. So I'm going to show you some pictures. I'm going to talk about how it works, financing, development, et cetera. And this second section is basically the highlights of a Lewis Center report on French social housing that was published a few days ago. So if you want to learn more, you can read a lot more. Always happy to talk about it too, if you want. And then the third section is from a working paper that's not yet published. It might be a major paper, I'm not sure yet, but it might be a minor paper, we'll see, about which kinds of social landlords build more housing in France. So why France? Well, people have talked a lot about Vienna's social housing system. Vienna is like a small homogeneous city in a rich country. France is like a big, messy, diverse, politically contentious country. And so I think the French social housing model yields a lot of lessons for a place like California or the US that Vienna just doesn't. Vienna also owns a lot of the land, et cetera, et cetera. So I think France is a good case. It's obviously very different from the US, but it kind of shares some similarities. Also, you know, the Netherlands or Denmark have are often talked about as the kind of the most social housing having countries in Europe because they have such a large percentage of their housing that's social housing, but France has by far the most in terms of absolute number of units. So France has over 5 million units of social housing today, and this graph shows the year in which those units of social housing were built. And so you can see already from the, like, they started 100 years ago, you can see 100 years ago, there was a little boom in social housing production in the interwar period, but it wasn't a lot of housing that was produced at that time. It's really after World War II, the 60s and the 70s, where production gets going like gangbusters of social housing in France. But that's not really the period we want to emulate because, as I'll show, there were some problems with those projects. And really, it's the kind of last 20 years where they've been back to building a lot of social housing in a way that I think is much more functional than previous periods. Question?
How does this connect to like population growth? I realize I don't know when the French population.
France was like a fifth of Europe's population in 1790. That's why Napoleon won. France just had so many people. It's crazy. I don't have the population growth trends. I mean, this connects more to the destruction of World War II and then desperate need for housing afterwards. It's also part of like a modernization and urbanization story. Like France after World War II, there's some statistics where like, or in 1940, like 90% of households didn't have a toilet in their house in France. So it was like a pretty poor and more rural country. So the like, urbanization stuff rather than population, what was happening at this time. Great, so let's just do a quick, less than 10-minute history. So this is a 1920s project in Lyon the neighborhood is called Les États-Unis, the United States, right? It was one of these big projects. It was like a slum clearance replacement project with public housing, with social housing in 1920s, right? And it's been rehabbed. It's super nice today. Actually, there's a museum and murals, and it's like the stock is still there and still lovely. Paris also had a lot of these 1920s, 1930s projects, especially in what was the former wall around the city of Paris and the kind of DMZ area outside of the wall. It's called the zone where the périphérique is now, like this really nice brick social housing projects from the 30s. They're super lovely. But what we really think about when we think about social housing in France is like modernist, big buildings, right? This is the famous Le Corbusier project in Marseille. That's super nice. I mean, it's like, I'm not an architect, but it's pretty amazing. Like some concrete and primary colors looks nice. Is that actually looks nice, or I just think it looks nice? I don't know. So this is the 1950s, right? So really in the 1950s is where these big social housing estates start getting built into the 60s and the 70s, and still in the 80s, they're building these big estates. This one I never visited. Most of these places I've been to, I never made it to Nancy, but I'm just kind of obsessed because that building is so freaking long. It's like almost a kilometer long, right? This is a huge, and this development for reference is like 3,600 units of housing. Pruitt-Igoe, 2,700 units of housing, right? So this is like bigger, and this is not even the biggest one, right? They get bigger, but I love this one just for the length of that building. It's very, very adventurous architecture. This is a very famous estate built in Lyon, in the southeast of Lyon, in an industrial area to provide housing for factory workers, essentially, at that time. And this is called Les Manguettes. Les Manguettes is a super interesting place, and this photo just shows the scale. It's like 4,000. It's building new neighborhoods, building huge new suburban neighborhoods, really. And I'll come back to Les Manguettes because it becomes a very important place in the 80s. Then in the 60s, you start getting some architectural whimsy. Start to get a little crazy. I love the La Grande Borne. I drove through there. It's a little sketchy maybe in parts of it, and not as fun on the ground. Like from the aerial view, it looks like more exciting. And then you get on the ground, it's like, okay, the building curves a little bit. There was a lot of critique, of course, even already in the first times that they were building these kinds of things. They talked about it like architecture from the sky rather than from the ground. Because a lot of this stuff was like planning on a map and far removed from people's experience. Even on the ground, this is another curvy one from the 1960s, Cité de l'Abreuvoir. And this one is one of the ones that I know a friend of a friend that lives there. And they said it's terrible because like the walls are curvy and you can't hang things, and like you lose space when you put the furniture, there's this weird little dead space behind it. So the architects, though, they had a lot of license when they're doing these projects, and they like the curvy buildings. This is Les Tournois. It's like by La Défense. It's actually really centrally located site. I think this is if you start thinking about like the implicit subsidy of living in one of these places, this is a site where you're getting a lot of implicit subsidy just because of the location. Me and Nick Morantz took a trip there one day. It's a nice neighborhood. But not just curves, there were also weird blocky shapes being experimented with. This is already in the 1970s, super suburban edge of northeastern Paris, and even some kind of Lego block. This is again back near La Défense neighborhood. This is in a whole estate that's just like 2 buildings that is one of these places that's trying to be redeveloped called Les Damiers. Has anyone seen The Hunger Games? You might recognize this from The Hunger Games, this weird like postmodern fascist architecture. This is by a Catalan architect that somehow got his hooks into the French social housing production system because he designed a lot of projects, Ricardo Bofill. This is called Espace Abraxas, and it's like creepy from this far away in this airplane. It's creepy from inside. Like, it's just weird. And this is already in the 1970s. Right? No, this is 1980s. This is 1981, right? They're still doing this, right? The US put a moratorium on public housing construction and blew up Pruitt-Igoe in 1972. But France just kept on going through the 70s into the 80s. This is another nicer one. I mean, this is also Bofill, a little bit more human scale. And then kind of the last whimsical one I'll show is, they call this the camembert because they're like cheeses. This is also the camembert. This is from 1985. So in 1985, they're still doing these big projects. So back to Les Manguettes, like if you're interested in this, so the 60s and 70s in France, 60s were economically well. The 70s, like everywhere, started having this recession. There was a lot of immigration from former colonies, and there was like kind of white flight from social housing, which had originally been built, for the working class. And so you started to get ethnic conflict. You started to get unemployment. You started to get conflicts between youth and police. And like France's long, hot summer, ours was 1968, theirs was 1981. And it started in Les Manguettes in Lyon, where people started burning cars and fighting with police. And the reaction was similar, right? So France started this program of, there was social unrest in a social housing estate. Like the French state was like, okay, we'll blow up some of your buildings because there's too many people there. It's interesting story, like we could talk about in the Q&A, like they've actually evolved on social housing rehabilitation programs, like renewal essentially, in a way that I think is much better than we have. They just have so many more of these spaces, they couldn't just, give up in a way we did, but we can come back to that. So Les Manguettes was important. If you want more color, like I can send you this thing. There's some really great news reporting from the time. If you want to check out some music from the moment, there's a great band named Carte de Séjour, Rachid Taha, who's like an Algerian child of Algerian immigrants in Lyon that has this cool kind of 80s. They were like friends with the Clash and stuff. Okay, fast forward, 2008, we're skipping over the 90s and the early 2000s to kind of what's the new good French social housing that people are talking about a lot, right? Most of this is infill housing. This is student social housing in Paris. These pictures are all from a great website if you want to look at pictures of social housing from all over Europe. It's called the Baffa Rivolta Award. It's an Italian foundation that gives an award for social housing architecture. And they have like a great treasure trove archival records of all these beautiful projects. So I have pictures from those. So this is student social housing. This is another student social housing from 2008. This is infill housing that's part of the system that eventually developed in France starting in 2009 after the financial crisis, where social housing landlords could buy housing built by the private sector. Previous to 2009, the social housing landlords built everything themselves. But after the financial crisis, there were all these empty houses owned by the private sector, and the French government said, okay, you can buy those. So this was built by the private sector, but purchased by social landlords. This is a mass timber project built by one of the big social housing landlords. This is just a really cute yellow window project. I love that. Near a low density neighborhood, nice. This is a 2015 project. This is from, there's still been pretty big ones, even these big buildings. It's not 3,600 units, right? It's 200 or 500, right? And this is part of a redevelopment area in the 13th in Paris on the Avenue de France.
Who's the guy with the Hitler stuff?
Some French guy, I don't know. Good question. Beyond the scope of this paper. This is a nice project in Bordeaux, right? They're still doing some architecturally weird, whimsical things, but there's a lot more attention to kind of like the living space, the interior space of these projects. Some aren't that amazing. They're just kind of getting mundane, right? This is like 60 units. This is like a very normal building in Montpellier. It's from 2019. So a lot of the social housing is smaller scale, more infill, and kind of less whimsical and cheaper to build. This is a project from Nantes in 2023. This is like an office conversion to social housing in Paris from 2024. And this is a wood project right outside Versailles, like right outside the gardens of Versailles. There's a really nice social housing project. Okay, enough pictures. How does it work? So how do these things get built? I'm going to talk about the financing structure, the developers, a little bit about the residents, and then the limits. So the big thing in Europe is they all use this cost rental model for building social housing that's very different from the way we do affordable housing in the US. So developers, social housing landlords develop a project, and to develop the project, they're mostly doing it using a big loan, a big low interest, long-term loan, right? They're putting in some of their own equity that they're getting from rents from existing projects. Yeah. The social landlords, right? So there's this whole world of social landlords. They're like a combination. Half of them are nonprofit companies and half of them are municipal housing agencies. There's about 600. I have more on that later, right? So these are kind of pretty independent actors. They both work within the same sets of rules, the municipal ones and the nonprofit ones. They get this loan, they put in some of their own equity, and they get some small amount of subsidy from local governments and from like a national system to build these projects. And they set the rents for these projects based on the cost of producing them, right? So they set the rents to pay off the loan essentially, and to cover maintenance. And so that's very different from the way we do affordable housing production in the US. We set rents based on to be affordable to the residents. So we set it at 30% of your income. And so we have much deeper subsidy for affordable housing in the US than they do in France. And as a result, we build a lot less with a similar amount of money. So yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna get there next slide. Where does all that money come from? Coming up. So then the social housing rents are not super affordable. They're like 70% of market rent because they're just set to pay off the loan and the maintenance. At the same time, France has direct rental assistance for all low-income renters. So the affordability comes from a voucher system that every renter gets if they're poor, whether or not they live in social housing. And like in contrast to how we sometimes think about in the US, like if I have a Section 8 voucher and I live in a LIHTC building, I'm getting like a double subsidy and that's problematic. In France, it's like part of the point, right? So there's a symbiotic relationship where low-income renters get a direct rental assistance and they're paying the social landlords a rent that covers the cost of building that building. So like as a system, it works in a more logical way than we do it in the US. So where do those loans come from? Well, it all goes back to Napoleon, it turns out, in France. Everything in France is like Napoleon. So Napoleon bankrupted the country, and when Louis XVIII took over, he's like, we need a responsible financial manager for the investment of the French state, and he created this organization called the Caisse de dépôt et consignation, the CDC, in 1816. And the Caisse created this savings fund through which everybody in France could save money that then would be invested by this government essentially organization, right? It's not an uncommon system in many countries in the world. Japan has this post office savings bank where then there's like some guaranteed interests. Your money's kind of guaranteed by the government, and at the same time, they're using that money to invest in development projects. In France, for the first, 85 years of the CDC, they were investing this money in bridges and whatever else, public infrastructure. And then in 1896, they started using it to invest in social housing, right? And so today, that's the vast majority of the loans come from this one huge organization. And so that huge organization kind of sets the terms for the loans. There's 4 categories of loans that the social landlords can choose to utilize when they're going to build a project, depending on the target population they want to reach. So you see like the biggest kind of social housing loan is eligible, like about half of the countries. I call it low income, but really up to the median income household is eligible to live in this kind of housing. There is a lower income one that's just for the 24% lowest income. And then there are categories of social housing loans where people up to the 70th percentile of income, so kind of above middle income, can live in it. And then the social landlord is looking at the rents that they can charge based on the cost of production and the cost of the loan. So this is the loan that the savings in the livret A gets you. And then so they add a little bit of margin to that rate that the savers are getting, depending on the kind of loan that it's being used for. I'll mention, so like anyone now can, I have 1,000 euros invested in French social housing. Anyone with a French bank account can put money in a livret A if they want. And we can talk about like, why do French people invest their money in this weird government-sponsored, low interest rate, low returns system, if you want. So within Europe, there's all these variations in how the countries set up their cost rental system. They're all more or less similar, but some are like strictly defined by, okay, how much was it cost? How much did it cost to build this specific project? How much does it cost to maintain this specific project? And the rents are exactly set to pay that back. The French system's a little different. So the national government sets rent maximums depending on the kind of loan that a landlord's getting and where they're being built. The rent maximums don't vary that much, but they do vary. So if you're building a project in Paris, you can charge a higher rent than if you're building a project in some town, right? And those maximums can, like, I've tried to get actual data on this, but it's very murky. Like the social landlords will say, oh, no, we're just getting cost recovery from this project by setting our rents at that. But actually they're making a little money off, especially the new projects, I think, as it turns out. And so that little bit of money they can't keep, they don't keep it. It's not, they're nonprofits. They reinvest that in more projects, right? So the rents are set by the government, not by on a project by project basis. Different countries do it differently. It's a little bit complicated. I mentioned this, I just want to show you a fun, weird French style of graphic. This is like the financing for a typical project, like the big box is a loan, a prêt. This is like other loans, even more other loans. So these are all loans. These are like own money of the social landlords, like their own equity. And then these are subsidies, right? So that's the makeup of building one building. Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned there's two main kinds of landlords. There's actually more, but like 97.5% of all social housing units are either a municipal housing office or a nonprofit company. There's like some co-op ones and some weird public-private ones, but the vast majority. France is like 1.5 times the population of California. How many housing units do we build a year in California?
13 with an ADU here and there.
So we build less than 100,000 housing units in California. About 10,000 of those are low-income housing tax credit units. France builds about 200,000 private sector units plus about 90,000 social housing units. So they build much more housing than we do. It's also a country, not a state, so that's different, but they're doing better. We can talk about French housing politics. And you can see that the social housing is happening all over the place. But you know, in the big cities, I mean, the map doesn't really tell you that much. I thought it'd be fun. So one thing that I just can't stop being interested in is like the origin, like these weird social housing companies. And like, I gotta say, my favorite by far is the train company of France, SNCF, has its social housing company with projects all over the country for the workers of the train company originally, right? But now anyone can live there. And they own like 100,000 units of housing. CDC Habitat, so CDC is this like Caisse de Dépôt, like the lender has its own social housing company that's huge. Action Logement is this parallel world of large employers have to contribute some money based on their payroll to housing for their workers. Like it comes from this era of like benevolent factory owners wanting to house their workers so that they'd work harder, probably. And so like Action Logement, there used to be these regionally fragmented employer social housing agencies that then they combine into one national network. But then individual, like this one, I have a cool picture if you want to see. That's like just you know, so there's like a Catholic charity that has a big social housing landlord. This one was like a guy from the resistance that was like a bureaucrat that really cared about housing. He created a social nonprofit company. But then there are also these like steel factory, Batigère is like a huge social housing company. It was like a huge steel factory. Pont à Mousson, there's like the PAM, they make the manhole covers in France or whatever. Like then they started their social housing land. So there's like big companies, some charities, and then some municipal ones. So Paris Habitat has 120,000 units, right? It's one of the bigger ones. And the Lyon Metropole has 30,000, right? So it comes from different sources. The post office one is very cute too. Post office social housing. Okay, so before I get into the research, there's some it's a long ongoing policy area, but it's also very dynamic. A lot of things have happened in recent years. It's like a nonstop action fest. Like France, unlike California, like we struggle to pass one law that's very minor. It takes a long time. It's not really effective. They're just like, we want metropolitan governments. Next year, all the cities in a metropolitan area have to make a metropolitan. I mean, they just do these like national level edicts where things change dramatically from year to year. It makes for great research designs. So one thing I mentioned is in 2009, they started allowing social landlords to buy privately developed housing. And that really goes along with the second law that they passed in 2000, which says all urban municipalities, so it's not every municipality, all the urban ones, have to have at least 20% of their housing stock be social housing. And if they don't, they have to pay a fine, and eventually they can like lose their powers to do urban planning. And so that really combined with this, where starting after 2009, a lot of cities created basically inclusionary zoning plans. And they created inclusionary zoning plans that differ from ours because in ours, like we force developers to build some affordable units, lose money, and provide housing to lower income households. In France, they force them to build a few units, so they're building a social housing, and then they sell those to the social landlords. So I think it's a more effective way to do inclusionary. In 2018, there was this law that really messed up our research project. They created a whole dissertation for one of my collaborators where they said, okay, all the social housing landlords that have fewer than 12,000 units, which is a lot of them, you have to merge with another one. You can't have fewer than 12,000 units, right? We don't want them all to be big for like fiscal efficiency and economies of scale. So they just force all these small social landlords to merge or get absorbed by like their big neighbor. So that's messy. And then I mentioned Action Logement, like the employer contributions for social housing were regionally managed until 2017 when they consolidated and they created this like huge organization that's extremely influential in the sector. Yeah.
We dig into the research. How is this working with like local zoning and location?
Mhm.
Like, does a social housing developer approach the city and say, "Can I build here?" Or is the city like, "Hey, you should build here"?
Although, for the recording, can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, sure. So the question is, how does it relate to local zoning and planning? Is it the case that the social landlords propose a project and then the city thinks about it? Or is it the case that the city's like, hey, do a project here for me? And the answer is both, right? Both. But the local government is very much involved. So they provide some subsidy in most cases. And they're the ultimate guarantor of these loans to social landlords from the CDC. So the local governments are very much involved.
Is there limits?
In
Like
what sense?
limits on how large you could do, where you could build, like typical American zoning?
I mean, yeah, they have zoning in France, absolutely. And they have very similar NIMBY issues. I mean, we can talk about it. One way that the locals have been bought into the process in a way that we don't, that I don't think I have in this presentation, but I talk about in the report, is that the way that social housing units are allocated is by a committee. And it used to be the case that the mayor had a lot of influence over who got the units being built in his city, right? So they're like, the committee's made up of some national social housing like regulatory agency people, the social landlord and the local government and the local prefect of the department. And so like they have a meeting about, okay, there's all these applicants, who are we gonna give these units to? And so there's like a lot of corruption scandals where like mayors are giving social housing units to their mistresses in Paris. That's famously. And so then there's been a lot of crackdown on that. And there's like this interesting political dynamic where like there's a lot of cities that are resistant to social housing and the mayors are like, well, like I would do it, but if you let me choose who gets to live there, then I'll do it. But if not, then I won't, right? So it's part of the political fight. Good question. Okay, so who lives in social housing? Like I said, like, you know, based on these loan categories, the eligibility to live there is pretty broad across the income spectrum. This is like this isn't actually individual incomes. It's like this unit of consumption that the OECD developed and France uses to talk about individual incomes based on household size. But you can see basically, I mean, just think about it as household incomes or some per person household incomes. And you can see the blue are social housing tenants and the red is everybody in France. So you can see that, you know, the residents of social housing skew lower income, but like there are higher income people that live in social housing, right? So it's pretty broadly, you know, it has become much more residualized over time, meaning that it's increasingly lower income people that live there. It's also become increasingly regressive within the system which is something I'll have a graph on in a second, about who lives in the better social housing units. It's not the poorest social housing tenants. Surprise, surprise. So I think if you think about kind of the limits and disadvantages of this kind of system, like the big one obviously are these big suburban modernist developments that concentrate poverty and unemployment and police brutality and whatever, right? So that, like, maybe we can think that's not a structural feature of social housing. That's just like what happened after World War II with the modernist architects took over. You know, systematically, I think you can think about a mismatch, especially the way it worked in France, moving within a social housing, like if you're a social housing tenant and you want to move within the system is very difficult. So you can move within the same landlord's properties, but to move to a different landlord's property, they have to like trade tenants. It's like this crazy antiquated system. There are other countries in Europe that have more efficient nationalized moving systems within social housing, but they're also imperfect. And so you get much more mismatch between kind of levels of housing consumption and what people want. So it's kind of like rent control where, you know, my house is way too small, but like it's such a good deal I could never move, or my kids moved out, but like if I moved, my rents would go up a lot, so I'm not going to move. So people are consuming kind of wrong place, wrong amount of housing. You do get crowd out. There's some pretty compelling evidence from the French economists that like for every social housing unit that's built, the private sector doesn't build more than one unit of private sector housing. So it's like you're subsidizing the system that you could just have a voucher system and you don't need the social housing system, the economists would say. And then within the system, you know, the better units are somehow occupied by richer households, right? So my brother has a good friend who's Californian French, and he lives in maybe the coolest social housing in France, in Paris, in like an artist's social housing building where he has his own studio and then a 1-bedroom and a little garden, like in central Paris. It's extremely nice, and it's €1,000 a month. And he's like, yeah, it's super expensive. He's like, they really got me on this one. It's super expensive, but I get to live here forever, right? I get to live here forever, and the rent goes up by 1% a year, right? So, I mean, on the other hand, like then you have artists living in central Paris. I don't know, maybe it's worth it. Systematically, though, there's a great urban economist in France named Guillaume Chapelle. He did the study where he calculated for each unit of social housing, what's the implicit subsidy? So what would a market unit next door to it of the same size and quality rent for? And he found, so he calculated this implicit subsidy, and then he has data on the incomes of people that live in these units. And so he can show like, do richer people live in social housing units with more implicit subsidy? And the answer is absolutely, because they mostly live in the ones in Paris, right? The Paris ones have much more subsidy than the ones in the countryside. And in the countryside, even like the social landlords and the private sector competing because, you know, the rents are very low. Okay, a lot of talking, so much talking. Everything okay? 10 more minutes? Yeah.
Hold on a second.
You mentioned a couple of times. Oh, sorry. You mentioned construction costs a couple of times. Is the land market handled differently, or
No.
is that just the cost of the housing includes land purchase? In other words, do local governments sort of cede land to the?
Yeah, so there is like cooperation. There are more redevelopment projects in France than in the US, I would say. So there's a good study of Paris, because I was very curious about this point. Like we think it's all like state managed redevelopment, but in fact, like Île-de-France region over the last 10 years, 25% of new housing is produced through like a state-led redevelopment approach, like one of these ZACs or like an eco district, but 75% is like, they call it diffuse densification or diffuse production or something, where it's like developers buying land and developing. So yeah. And I mean, that's for the whole housing system. I don't know for social housing versus privately built. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this research project less than 10 minutes. It's been a fun collaboration with a really cool researcher in Lyon named Florence. Very nice lady from the École Normale Supérieure, the normal superior school, which is like these, you know, they used to have teacher schools back in the day, and now they're just universities. And her PhD student, Roman, and the question is fairly simple. It's kind of like stylized facts paper where we're just interested in which kinds of social landlords build more. And the reason I was originally interested in that was for a place like California, where when you talk about creating social housing, people say, well, they've been doing it for 100 years. Like, how can we catch up? They use the revenues from existing buildings as equity to produce new buildings. So like there's these nonprofit housing companies, they have a revenue stream that they can use for 15% down to build a new project. And like, we just don't have that ecosystem right now. And so that made me wonder, like, is it the social landlords that have a lot of old stock that are building more? That was my main interest. Also, like peripherally, like, do the municipal housing corporations or the nonprofits build more? Like the municipal ones, like they're connected with the municipality, they can get the access to the guarantee of the loan, the access to land, maybe much easier than a nonprofit. So like, question mark, do they build more? But maybe kind of they're not as motivated to try hard. And was a funny thing, like American guy in France, I'm like, talking to social people that work in the sector, I'm like, so why does your company like build more? I've talked to a bunch of social landlord employees. I'm like, you guys are like trying harder than the other guys. Like, what's going on? And they're like, I don't understand. Like, I just do. I'm like, but you don't get more money if you try harder. They're just like, but I care and I try hard. Like, but so I'm curious, like whether it's like these structural things that lead to some companies building more, or is it like some companies hired the best workers for some reason? They have some inspiring person, and we don't have data on where Roman is been on a mission to get data of like where people went to school, for example, at different social housing companies to see if that affects their level of production, because the difference in rates of production is fairly high, right? That was my academic interest. And then the last one is more for the French audience. Like the French government said 12,000 units is the perfect, like 12,000 and up is right. Below 12,000 is too small. And like, who knows where they got that from? Like there's some rumors about why they got that from a weird budget committee meeting at some point. Somebody said like their revenues should be 50 million a year, which means they own 12,000, like some like arbitrary way that they got that, not from anything about efficiency or effectiveness. So it's a simple project where we have a bunch of data and we do a regression to answer all these hypotheses and look at the correlations in a multivariate setting between construction rate and size of landlords, the age of the stock, where they're active, et cetera, et cetera. Are the landlords building in hot markets like Paris building more than landlords in Rust Belt, Saint-Étienne? We have a really cool data set, the Repertoire de Parc Locatif Social, that has a line for every single housing. It's 5 million plus lines of data, right? So each unit, and it has the year built, the landlord, the loan, how much the rent is, how big it is, where it is, all these things, right? So it's a really fantastic data. I don't have this, Roman has like the secret big data set. I have like the public smaller data set, but it's a very fun data set. And we combine with a couple other things. We're not done. We need stuff on the political affiliation of mayors, for example, and this thing I mentioned about like the staff, where did they go to school, for example. If you have other ideas on measurable features of an organization that might be associated with it trying harder, I'm open to that. So we're using as a dependent variable the construction rate. So we take how many units did you build in the last 5 years, divided by how many units you started out with at the beginning of that time period to look at the rate of construction. And this is like a box and whiskers plot that shows, you know, these are the municipal ones, Office Public d'Habitat. This is the Entreprise Sociale d'Habitat, and these are the other ones. But basically, these are the nonprofits and those are the municipals. And you can see the nonprofits are building 8% growth over 5 years and the municipals 3% growth over 5 years. So just from the beginning, nonprofits are building much more than municipals. Some complications. I mentioned this merger law messes up the data. We're looking at 2012 to 2022, but in 2018, they said you have to merge. So all of these landlords disappear from the data set. Luckily, I didn't have to deal with that. Roman did everything. But you can see like, you know, we lose a whole bunch of observations during the time period. We just don't use the ones that disappear. And we have a control for, did you absorb another, you know, did you absorb somebody? Did you eat your neighbor? And you can see naturally that the size of the landlords is growing over time. The other complication was this VEFA thing I mentioned, which is the landlords that can buy units built by the private sector. And I was actually really surprised because I would have suspected that nonprofit companies would be using this much more than the local government. I was thinking local governments, like they have their competence in producing, they got some vertical integration. But in fact, they're using both municipal housing companies and the nonprofits are using this purchase of privately built housing in the same rate. You can see they're like the red and the blue one, the green one is the other. But you can see that like in 2012, only less than 20% of stock like that was produced in 2012 was purchased from the private sector. And by now, it's almost half of the stock that's being purchased by the private sector. So clearly the social landlords like this. Clearly they're getting something out of it. There's a study by the National Social Housing Review Agency that finds that it's cheaper if the private sector builds it and it's quicker if the private sector builds it, unfortunately. But then of course, like you have these longtime social housing advocate people that are saying like, no, it's terrible. Like we're gonna lose our competence in producing housing and like they can't build it the special way that we can build it. Very, very, very big debate in France. Okay, so those are the complications. Now we're curious, do bigger companies build more? I forgot to traire la vache. So like the French call like using the revenues from old buildings to build the new buildings, they call that milking the cow. So are they milking the cow? Milking the cow. Milking the cow.
Oh,
Traire.
my bad.
So are they milking the cow? Are they doing it? No, they're not. So no and no, right? So we find that bigger isn't better. So we don't see economies of scale in an obvious way, right? So bigger companies do not produce more housing in terms of production rates. Landlords with more old stock build less than landlords without old stock, right? So they're not milking the cow. And I suspect it's because they can milk the new cows better than they can milk the old cows or something, right? Because I think because of the way the rent limits are set, they can charge the maximum rent in Paris for a new project and still get some of that equity to build more. We find that the SRU law is effective. So in cities where they're deficient, they're below this 20% threshold, landlords that have housing in those cities build more than landlords in other cities. Yeah.
And so that statement is true for both as a percentage and as a count?
No, but as a count, it's just like, yeah, bigger ones build more because they're bigger, right? So I think you can't do it in count terms. Doesn't make sense. Yeah, I mean, the as a percentage is a little weird. It's not exactly what you want, but there's not a good solution to these kinds of dependent variable creation, unfortunately. Yep, so that's what we find. I've got some regression. I mean, I guess just the only thing with this bunch of numbers is like, this is initial stock, so that's like the size. And you can see that very not that significant and very small, but like municipal ones, if they're bigger, they build a little tiny bit more, it's not that significant. And the social housing, the companies, if they're bigger, they build a little bit less, it's not that significant. So it's basically a wash. So I'd say good news for people in California that want to create a social housing system overall. It's not the old, beautiful brick buildings in Paris that are producing a bunch of money to build new housing. But you know, maybe we should think a lot about the limits and disadvantages of doing a social housing system like this. And there are many other aspects of many other aspects of, you know, institutional things that happen in France that maybe could never happen here that make it impossible to replicate this system. But I think, yeah, those are my findings. Thank you so much for your attention.
Are we supposed to sit here? Is that what these are for?
I mean, they're pretty cool. Director's chairs.
Yeah. Well, I feel awkward sitting in this, but I'm going to ask you one or two questions. Just out of curiosity, how many people are interested in asking a question? So I know how much time to take for myself. Not that many. Maybe I can ask a couple. All right. So first, I'm going to ask the question that Paavo wanted me to ask him, which is about the politics stuff. So, you know, we have our, I'm just going to stay over here.
But I might want to show more pictures. Look at that one.
Oh, yeah.
Because our camera is pointed over here.
Oh,
Yes,
perfect.
yes. Well, I don't need to be on the camera. I guess I'm just curious what the politics look like there. We have our YIMBY politics, we have our NIMBY politics, we have the people who say they want housing, but only if it's social, public, affordable, whatever. Is that essentially what's happening there? Is it totally different? Like, how are the battle lines drawn? What are they fighting over politically on this?
That's a great question. Thanks, Shane.
I didn't write it myself. You just gave me some notes.
So, yeah, I mean, I think so. One stat that I looked up to just today is there are 1,500 mayors in France that are members of the Communist Party. So like the French political spectrum is much wider than the US political spectrum. And there, you know, so like there's these suburban cities of Paris, Ivry-sur-Seine, and it's like they're communists, like they just are still, everything is social housing there, 100%, right? And they want to build a lot, right? They want only social housing, they want more of it. So I think the range of attitudes is much more different, and the convictions about whatever ideological commitments is very different. There isn't a YIMBY movement in France at all in the way there is here, like a bottom-up social movement of YIMBYism. But France actually started doing YIMBYism in 2000, way before we did. In 2012, there was a research study sponsored by the French government called BIMBY, Build in My Backyard. They got us, they scooped us, and they started doing things in 2014. For example, the French government, the national government said cities can no longer use FAR to limit the size of housing in their municipalities, right? So they started doing
Floor area ratio.
Floor area ratio, yeah, like building volume. So the French state has like much more pro-growth than any state or federal government of the US, and much more interventionist in a way. So I don't think. Then the social housing world, there's definitely people that only want social housing, like I said, the communists. But like I think another big difference in the politics around housing production is because there are these huge social housing landlords, they have associations and unions and big, like if you ever want to go to a super fun thing that I'll go maybe next year. I didn't get to go. In September, there's like the conference of all of the social housing landlords of France in Montpellier, and it's supposed to be like this huge deal, but like they have a lot of political power in a way that in the US, like multifamily, like nonprofits, housing developers don't have a lot of political power. Multifamily developers don't have a lot of political power. So I think there's just like totally different.
Yeah, for all the talk about developers running the show, there's not really like there's the National Association of Home Builders for single family developers, and they are actually very powerful nationally and at the state level, but there probably exists a multifamily version of this, but it is not influential.
Yeah. And then just real quick, I mean, like NIMBYism, I mean, the parallels between suburban NIMBYism and France and here are very high. Like there are these petit villas. I mean, in their case, like their little village is really cute in a way that our suburbs aren't cute at all. Like they have a church from 1420 or whatever. But yeah, they're doing NIMBYism in the same way. And it is funny, like with some of the new state, national interventions into local stuff around social housing, like these little villages outside of Lyon, they have to have social housing. They really don't want to. And now their new thing that this people were telling me is like green. They're like, they're doing green. Like this guy said, I came up with a new term. It's called green NIMBYism. I'm like, we invented that in California 40 years ago. But at least like, yeah, they're saying like they would like to build the social housing, but for the ecological reasons, the building is too big. So there is like very much parallel on that point.
All right, I want to ask one more here. And this is about like the role of the state, like literally the state in the case of California. So I think the national government, the federal government is unlikely to be doing anything on social housing in the next several years, maybe ever. But California is a big state. It's a rich state. We're interested in this stuff. So like, what can we do? What can't we do? I mean, the thing I come back to often is the loans seem to be such an important part of this, but states have to operate with a budget, a budget balance, a balanced budget. They can't run a deficit like the federal government, so they just can't loan out endless amounts of money. And housing is very expensive, so it seems like that would be a really big limiting factor. So, what do you suggest for the state of California if we wanted to kind of go it on our own?
Yeah, good question. And then, so before I answer the specific question, I think real quick, it's interesting to think about housing politics at a state level where there are other states that people can move to if we screw it up, versus housing politics at a national level. I mean, I don't think that's why France is like pro-growth in the way that it is. Like it has been for a long time, but I think there's just something different if like there's no Arizona for people to move to. There's no outlet valve for the French, right? And so I think that does change stuff. I don't know. I haven't thought through that enough, but So like the big source of money in France is this livret A account. It's like one big question I ask a lot of people is like, why do you save money? Like, isn't there like competition in terms of your savings vehicles? Like, aren't you invested in a Vanguard or whatever else? And I think for a long time, so they save more in France, and for a long time, their options were very limited in terms of where people could save. And so people have there's like this caisse d'épargne, the savings bank. It was just like this. Florence actually told me this. Sort of like, choose a kid. Every kid gets this little book with a squirrel on it. It was like the petit écureuil, and you get a little book, and like you save money, and you build up this culture of saving in this very safe, kind of secure but not high interest rate thing. And so like that culture now has created this big pool of money that the government can use to build social housing. And like California could create a livret A account and a CDC to invest it. The question is like, would people, I mean, we can also do bond financing for this stuff. But like, would people save their money in it? Like if we created a new campaign, it's like the California bank, it's like a little bear, and you put in some money, and it's like you get 1.5%, and it's tax free. Like, I don't know. I feel like
Bear markets are not.
yeah, so that's, I think, the bigger challenge. So like on that front, the money thing, I think we could take care of it. I don't know.
Also, I don't know if we could do tax-free because the federal government still might tax it. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so we'd have to spend more money on it in a way that they don't, but yeah.
All right. Who else got a question? I'll give you the microphone. You already asked one.
Thank you. Sorry. You answered this a little bit, but I was curious if you could elaborate. What are the flows into and out of social housing, and what's the average duration? So like, what would it compel someone to want to move into one, and why would someone choose to leave? And then how long are people staying in their units?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know the mobility, I mean, in the report, there is some data. I mean, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I know that mobility rates are much lower. I mean, like with all public housing in other countries as well, like people are much less likely to move out once they're in. The mobility rates are lower. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, in one big change is like the cultural connotation of social housing has changed a lot over the years. And now it's like, more associated with immigrants and with lower income households, except for when it's like a really good deal, right? And so like the artist housing thing, I know more than one person. I know the guy that lives in one, and I know another guy on the waiting list. And he's totally financially fine, but he's like, if I ever get one of those, I'm definitely moving in. So I think like the structural issue with the way it becomes regressive is that like the better units, like higher income households can wait longer, and they don't have to move in. There's not like desperation that's leading them into it. So they're only going to move in if the unit is a good deal. And then once they have a good deal, they're never going to leave. But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think it really depends on which one, right? Because there is such a wide variety. But like, it's not an aspiration to go live in the Grand Born.
Did you say during the presentation how long the waits tend to be? I'm sure they vary a lot.
I didn't know. Yeah. I mean, there's a funny thing in like France, they're like, we have a housing crisis. There's 2.6 million people on the waiting list for social housing. And then I'm like, either that's like people desperate, or like social housing is a really good deal. So like I should get on the waiting list too. Like it's a weird indicator. I always thought that.
Other question?
Housing crisis.
So, Paavo, you talked about the about the sort of aggressive federal policy supporting social housing, and you talked about that there are parallels with NIMBYism between here in the U.S. and California specifically. You mentioned as well that there's likely some effect on the behavior of private developers, and I'm just wondering, are there as many obstacles to development in the private market in France as there is in the U.S. or is the fact that things are sort of expedited for social housing, has that had the same effect in terms of building housing in the private market, or what's the relationship with this huge social housing movement on private market housing development?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it would be hard to answer that exactly, but I do think that I can say there are fewer constraints to housing production in France. I mean, it's a much more non-discretionary kind of ministerial permitting system. in making plans, there is a lot of resistance to density, and mayors have a lot of power over heights and stuff. I mean, so when the national government said you can no longer use floor area ratio to restrict housing supply in cities, then cities were like, okay, we're going to do a combination of height limits and lot coverage. We are not using floor area ratio. So like this guy has a paper on like the Hydra effect of like they're just like, and they're like, okay, we'll figure out how to get to the same place. And so the requirement to have 20% social housing is interesting in contrast with like California's RENA process, because we have like a growth target of which some of it is low income housing, affordable housing, but there it's just social housing. It's just a percentage. It's not a growth target. So Paris, for example, is actually a pretty NIMBY city. I mean, maybe it's worth it because it's so beautiful, but like they're not building new social housing. They're just switching the percent by buying old housing and converting it to social housing. So it's not new production. Yeah, I think the NIMBYism politics is very similar, and there's a lot of suburban cities. I mean, I think the other big difference is there are just they didn't do urban renewal as well as we did. They were bad at it, even though they wanted to. Like the mayor of Lyon apparently came to LA in the 60s and was like, yeah, we got to get some of these giant freeways in Lyon. And like went back and tried to, like, at that time, the medieval old Lyon, like right on the river, what's now like the beautiful tourist spot, was very decrepit and run down. He's like, we're going to destroy it and put a tunnel through the hill. And then he just didn't have the power to do it, right? They ran out. I mean, luckily, they were trying to do urban renewal in the 70s when all the money ran out. Also in Paris, they wanted to do it. And so, I think that, so they still have all these big urban cities. They have a big urban constituency. And so I think like in those contexts of like the city of Lyon or something, and the bigger stuff like the Long Beaches of Lyon, they're just more pro-growth because rich people live in cities and they are fine with it in a way that we don't have. Then like the small suburban cities are where it's very similar, I would say.
All right, so that was terrific work, but it leaves me feeling very pessimistic. So let me summarize why and get your reaction from you. So I hear 5 things that make that system work. If you want, the social entrepreneurs are there. These are the guys who wake up in the morning and say we can do it.
Right.
If they want land, the zoned land will be available to them pretty quickly because the city says can make that happen. If there's a regulatory requirement that says you've got to do this, you've got to meet the 20% requirement. There's cheap money which is available.
Yeah.
And there's a guaranteed cost plus return because of the way the rents are set.
Yeah.
Now, if I walk through each of those 5 in the Californian case, on a scale of 1 to 10, I suspect very few would get above 3 out of 10. I don't want to leave pessimistic.
No, I think here's the cheap money is the only thing we don't have. I think all the other things would have. I mean, I think if there were 40-year loans at 2% or something, like people could make it. All the other stuff could come up. Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a lot of affordable developers in California about whether they use the housing element sites inventory for a different project, but they all say like my constraint isn't land, my constraint is money. So I mean, they would have to be charging much. I mean, the reason I'm excited to engage with the debates over social housing in the next year, as the state maybe takes it back up and the Turner Center produces their report, is that I think what's being imagined for California social housing is not what they do in Europe. It's a much more heavily subsidized thing like what we already do in the US. And I don't think that's going to have much of an impact here. I think, but if we were willing to charge rents to cover costs, which are going to be not low, but they're going to be lower than the market, and they could stay that, they could be regulated. I think if there was a cheap source of money, it could work.
Can you follow up on that last bit a little bit, the construction cost side of things? Because, right now we're spending $700,000+ per unit on subsidized housing. And, if you were doing a cost plus, you'd be charging, I don't know, $5,000 a month or something. And so that's clearly not going to work. So what's the vision for getting the cost under control, or how that relates to this?
Build it cheaper. So I thought about, me and Arthur Acklin thought we were going to do a comparative paper to figure out why they can build it so much cheaper there. I mean, there are a number of reasons, some of things we could do and some things we can't do, that, they build housing for 150,000 euros a unit or something, but it's only it's only 580 square feet.
Mhm.
There's no parking, there's no basement. If there's parking, it's really small. It's single stair. The elevators are really tiny and cheap. I mean, they have they standardize things. There's a lot of prefab.
And 150,000 euros is a lot more there. I think
Also,
their
the salaries
GDP
are
per
like-
capita is something like half ours here. So
The salaries are way lower. I mean, one of the things that like I eventually came to when I went to this one of these conference mobile tours in Paris, and we went to this cool project in the city of Stein, spelled Stains, pronounced Stein. Really interesting city of Stein, where there's like a huge population of Roma have come. Like there's started to be some Roma moving there, and then suddenly there's like lots of Roma, and so these like architects created this nonprofit, and they're building like this temporary housing thing for Roma families. And I was talking to them, and they're like, "Oh yeah, like we're like all these young, trying hard, energetic. We just graduated 2 years ago from planning school or architecture school, and like I'm like, but are you making any like?" You're basically they're volunteers almost. And they're like, yeah, but I don't have any debt. Housing's really cheap. My healthcare is taken care of. I get the discounted train thing till I'm 25. Like it's just this whole like that we can't do anything. The salary thing and all that.
Yeah.
But all the building level stuff, like we could build smaller, less fancy buildings.
listen to the last 3 episodes of our
Yeah,
podcast on building
Plug.
code things.
Elevator
Uh,
report is really good. Read the elevators report.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question that was similar to that. I was curious when you mentioned after the reg passed in which the social housing developers could just purchase buildings that were built privately, you mentioned that there's a debate around how the private buildings were going up faster and perhaps more efficiently in France in relation to social housing development. I'm curious if there are any thoughts on why that's the case.
Yeah, no, I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like so there's this agence, like a control agency of social housing on Coles, and they
Yeah.
put this report where I got those data from. But then other people that I've talked to about that, they're like, I don't think it's true.
Interesting.
Da da da. Like we have more. I mean, yeah. So I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, I was wondering, are there any differences in labor regulation?
Quite possibly, yeah. No, it's
But not-
beyond the
okay,
scope of my
yeah,
knowledge.
yeah.
I needed to stay another year for that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Gonna give it to
Give it to our associate faculty director here to close it out.
No, that's a lot of pressure. Well, so one of the things that I think the last couple of questions and your response has gotten into maybe implicitly is the fact that you very well covered and documented the difference in the kind of population served by social housing in France. And I think any of us who know anything about American public housing plus vouchers plus whatever subsidies, it's a very different population, right? And that's not, we could say, oh, well, this country, the United States, is not very generous with subsidies. That's part of the story. We don't want to cover people who have jobs or who have like lower middle class incomes.
Right.
The other piece of this goes back to the beginning of the public housing system in this country, which was heavily influenced by the private sector that did not want competition from the public sector. You hinted at that. You talked a little bit about that quickly somewhere in there. Brian talked a little bit about this with kind of the zoning aspect of this, but there's also, I think, I'd just be curious to know a little bit more about what the French private sector thinks about the fact that a huge share of their customer base is served by the public sector instead of them, right? So that is one barrier or hurdle in this country to having a public housing system that not only serves more people, but also cross subsidizes in a better way, right? Like people who can afford more rents can make maintenance more doable and all that sort of stuff. So yeah. Competition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't, what I know about it is more related. Yeah, there are a lot of debates about changing the rules of the social housing loans, especially at the higher end. So one of the big debates was this fourth category of loan, which goes up to 86th percentile of income. And those, like, I think there's a lot of push from the private sector and sort of from the center right politicians to say like, oh, we should have this category of social housing that's like for upper, almost upper income households. And part of the push there, I mean, it's a little not answering your question, but part of the push there was from rich suburbs that wanted to use that to count for their 20%. They're like, we want to have social housing up to 20%, but it's like this kind of social housing, upper income. The private sector, though, the private sector real estate industry has a lot of influence in French national politics, and there are several different laws in recent years that have like given them favorable tax treatment for building housing in certain kinds of places. So like 0% loans, and like you don't have to pay VAT and stuff. So there is like, you can see their influence there. I don't know that, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much like they're pushing to compete, like to push out social housing to compete with it. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. But there are, yeah, I mean, there are these, yeah, they get benefit. I mean, you talk to like a lot of French academics and they're like, oh, it's terrible. Like they're getting all these giveaways to the private real estate developers. They're terrible. Yeah.
All right, that is the last question. Give Paavo here a round of applause.